Paige, do you have it recording?
Yeah, I think it's automatically recording, so we should be good. We have one more person in
Okay.
the group. Does anybody know if he said he was coming? I guess I'll give it a minute. Okay, well, I guess we can just get started without him and maybe he'll join in. Um, I
Hopefully.
wasn't sure like what you guys thought would be the best way to go about it. Maybe like start with question one and I'll give our answers and then go down.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Do we want to talk about just like our personal views of the thing first before we get into it? Or,
We can
I mean, we could just dive right in, it doesn't matter.
doesn't matter to me. We could start off with that. I just want to make sure we hit 30 minutes. I don't know if he's still expecting us to do 30 minutes if not everybody shows up or I mean,
Right.
but um I mean, I guess I can start the documentary. I mean, it was kind of like I'm not like into like fantasy sports at all, so like not that it wasn't interesting to me because it definitely was like figuring out like how it all started because I never knew it started with baseball. I never knew it started in like the 80s. So that was interesting to me. Um, I don't know, like what you guys thought about it.
Oh, sorry about that. I was doing something. I'm back, but it was just interesting to find out how sports started. I didn't know anything about that. I never even heard of the rotisserie league.
Yeah.
I personally, I love the take on it, like how they sarcastically like explain it. Like I love that they got other actresses to play like the younger versions of them, and then they like got dressed up like old timey for the first meeting, and I love that point of view of that. But the whole thing, like I was not excited to watch a 50-minute video, like I'm not gonna lie, but like just it was a good video then in the end. Like I'm glad I did watch it.
Feel like the acting kind of made it like more like bearable to watch rather than like feeling like I was just watching
Right.
something about like history.
Yeah.
But I guess we can just get into the first question. Um, does anybody else want to start or I can start? Doesn't matter.
Somebody else start because I'm confused on that part. Like, what article were you supposed to read?
Um, there was an article in the week two B2L like shell. I think it was I forget what it was called. It was something about the NFL.
It's like new media in NFL. Like it talked about Madden and fantasy football and stuff.
Okay, so I read that, but I'm trying to figure out how that relates to the film. That's all I'm like concerned with.
They talked
I
a lot
think it's just
about race in the article and they didn't talk about race in the documentary at all unless I
no,
missed
there was no race.
There was nothing
There,
about that's why I'm like, how are we gonna relate the article to the film when
pretty much
I'm
like
confused
what
on that.
I put was the biggest like way to compare the two was they both talked about like a like fantasy league being like a major business like money wise.
yes.
So I think in the documentary they said that 25 million Americans were playing fantasy football. That was in 2014, I think. And it brings in
Hmm.
$1 to $2 billion annually. So I think that was definitely interesting how much money it brings in. I mean, I could have guessed that, but um, having the actual stats there was good. That was something they talked about in the movie a little bit and then also in the article. So that's pretty much what I compared the two. I didn't like really find much else that they really didn't talk much else about like anything that they talked about in the article.
No.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know what to relate that on, but I still want to get like points for this, unless we like start our own discussion. Because I mean, what I pulled from it, because I read something where the NFL was reluctant to start their fantasy football because of gambling, but they started it anyways
Yeah.
because they can make revenue from it. Just like the rotisserie league, where they basically stole the idea from these guys
Mm-hmm.
for revenue
Yeah.
purposes. So they see it as like a business opportunity.
Yeah.
Like in the movie, they said about like if you just think about the first 8 or 9 guys, whatever it was in the rotisserie league, think about the winner of that league, how much money they earned. Like they sold that one guy for $26.
Mm-hmm.
And like, no, that's not a lot of money in today's terms or whatever, but just for a group of 9 friends,
Yeah.
like you could win obviously a lot of money at the end of it based on whatever you spent to get your players and whatever everybody else spent. Because I think that you won the money in the end. I'm not really sure about that.
And I
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
like,
you.
But
It depends.
yeah.
and then they said like when they were talking about how the game started to pick up globally with the book and everything else, they said about how they were trying to like get the like record for it, like not record, how they were trying to like say, hey, we started this, and like get the what's it called, the I don't know, like
Oh, with the two
recognition,
different
the
ends.
recognition of it. Um, and then he was just like, it just became too big and we couldn't do it. Like we couldn't prove that we made it.
Right.
You know what I mean? And just like in the same way that they got robbed of their idea is the same way that like the players are getting robbed of like themselves.
Yeah.
Like with how fantasy leagues have picked up so much and you're betting on the person, but like does that person earn anything back from it?
Right. I um I mean sports in general, I feel like it's all just about like the money. And like they mentioned, I think I mentioned this in one of my other questions, but they mentioned how in the article it said something about like players, elite athletes being like property, and like people look at them as like a piece of property because it's like pretty much just like them being a moneymaker.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that is shifting in today's aspects. You have people like what's a recent example? You got Ezekiel Elliott, where he sat out until they paid him the money he wanted to get paid. Same thing with Dak Prescott.
Mm-hmm.
James Harden sat out because he wanted a trade to happen. He didn't want to stay in Houston, so he was sitting out. He wasn't going to practice, so it's like forcing their hand. Like nowadays, you're starting to see players not taking over from like owners and stuff, but it's becoming more on their side because without the players, the league is nothing.
Right.
Examples of that are so with COVID, the 76ers had 8 players, but their head coach also had COVID, so he was out. But even though they had 8 players instead of like half their roster, they still played and they just moved up an assistant coach.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like without the players, what the league's gonna be?
Yeah. Um, so I guess going back to the first question, other than the money, um, like I said, I don't really know like how much else like I can compare the two. But I also did look up the documentary came out in 2014, and they said that 25 million Americans played fantasy league back then. So I
Mm-hmm.
looked up just to like see what the numbers are today, and I think it like doubled. So there's like
Yeah.
50 million people as of I think it was 2018 playing fantasy sports today. So like you can see how much it grew. But my main thing was like I thought it was crazy like how I feel like so many people play it, but I guarantee you nobody really knows like where it started.
Yeah. And for the number 3 question, like I don't want to jump around, but just like we had to look up another article to read. And to confirm what you found, like in my article that I read, it said about 500,000 people playing fantasy baseball in 1988. And then currently there's about 59 million,
Yeah, that's
which is,
crazy. Um, so for question number two, um, there wasn't a lecture, like he didn't post a lecture with a PowerPoint, so I basically just based it off of like the D2L discussion and like people's responses. And a lot of people in the discussion board I felt pretty much the same way about the comment that was made in the article that fantasy essentially gives people the opportunity to imagine athletes as property. um,
right.
so in comparing that to the documentary, the one part that kind of stuck out at me is the part when, I mean, it might have been like jokingly, but he traded his player for a shirt. I don't know if you guys remember that
Yes.
part. And I feel like it was probably like just a joke at the time, but like it's kind of like symbolizing like what happens in the league now. Like it's almost like, oh, like I'm worth a shirt, like how people like treat players and treat them like property. Like that was kind of what I compared the two.
Mm-hmm.
To go off what you're saying, I agree with that. But like I love basketball. I really don't follow like baseball and stuff. And how me and my friends were talking about this, how I see that happening in basketball is if a player isn't that good and a team is trying to free up cap room, like let's say J.R. Smith, if he still was in the league, but to use him as an example, they would trade him, like we'll give you him maybe like a late draft pick and like you give us $2 million. So we get more cap room. So it's like you're trading away a player for money.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they are property. And then it's like whenever they try to voice their opinions and stuff, it all gets shot down. It's like they're only there to play, but they're players with like emotions and feelings too.
Yeah. In one of my responses on the forum, I know I compared it to like the game in Monopoly. Like when you're playing Monopoly and you buy the properties, and then once you buy the properties, you buy the buildings to put on it, like the hotels and the houses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you buy your team, and then you buy which players you want on it. Like imagine how cutthroat Monopoly gets. And now you're putting it into like with actual people, and you're trading people, and you're making people pay you for using your teams or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, and I also feel like in the discussions, a lot of people are saying like they realize it's a problem, but like, what are you going to do about it? There's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
Um, and that's basically like I said about before when they were like they kind of got robbed of their idea, because once it became such a big thing to play fantasy with your friends or like online or whatever, there's just no way to stop
Mm-hmm.
it's imagination. There's no way to take back the imagination you gave to people.
Yeah. And I think the question in the discussion board was like, what can we do? Like, how can we make it better? And like, where does it start? And a lot of people said it starts with like the owners of teams, like, but and I think we were specifically talking about the NFL in the discussion board. They said like the owners of teams is
Or
like where it can start, and like where we can start to see change is like within the owners and like maybe the owner of the NFL. Um, but I thought it was interesting. I never really like thought about it. I mean, I watch sports, but like I never really thought about how deeply rooted the whole problem with like treating players like property is until I guess this week when we watched the documentary and did the discussion board and read the article.
right.
I mean, I kind of had an idea of it. An example is this: the Clippers owner, I think, 2000. It was real big. It was on the news. I don't know if you guys follow basketball. It was something bust, but I think it was a conversation with his wife that had got leaked, and it was like some racial slurs in there, and like players sat out and stuff.
I
They
remember
didn't want to
that.
play. But my thing is, you have these owners who are probably like billionaires. They don't know nothing about basketball, football. They just own teams
Mm-hmm.
for revenue.
Yeah.
Were you the person that put it in last week's discussion? Because I remember reading about the Clippers and that happening in
Oh
the
no, no,
last
no.
week's discussion.
No, I didn't put that
Yeah.
in last week's discussion. But that's just like an example of like
Yeah.
players being property.
Um, yeah, I forgot about that happening. That was a couple years ago, but that is a good example because it's like they don't
Mhm.
care. Like you're throwing out racial slurs when you own a basketball team that's mostly black players. Like they don't care about their team, they just care about the money that they're bringing in.
And then
Right.
even when events like this happen, time goes on. So it's like, I mean, the owner they replaced them with, we don't know. But it's
Mm-hmm.
like this stuff, like it just like it breeds other stuff. Like LeBron James is like on the Mount Rushmore, especially for NBA players. And they were talking about like, because there's a lot of things they dislike about the league. So about 2 or 3 years ago, they were headbands, but they started like wearing them like how ninjas wear stuff, and the league banned it. I don't know like what's the harm in wearing a headband in style, but there's a lot of things they banned. They were talking about like what if NBA players or like LeBron, he started his own league
Mm-hmm.
because they don't agree with the policies of the NBA and how the NBA is moving. And that's like a great discussion because I think it would be a great idea if LeBron started his own league.
Yeah.
think that's something in all sports, like just once you get so big with something and you don't care about the little guy anymore, that's something that happens in all of the sports where the little guys they want to fight back and, you know, take their own idea of what's happening and make their own thing, which is one of the things that I actually had in my notes about the what do you do to stop it? You can't stop it. People are going to continue to do what they want to do once you give them that idea and they run with it.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to add anything else for question 2 before we move on to 3? Okay. So the journal article that I found from my outside source, it was, I don't remember the name of the article. I might be able to pull it up actually. Yeah. It was called You're Underestimating Me and You Shouldn't, a Women's Agency in Fantasy Sports. So I found this article and I thought it was interesting because it talks about the issues that we still have today regarding women in sports. And I talked about this in my first discussion post, just how women aren't taken seriously in sports. I feel like that's like an ongoing issue. And it was the meme that I found for the first week. But this article talked about how 80% of Americans participating in fantasy sport are men. And I think that's kind of mainly because women are more like discouraged to play because they won't be taken seriously. And I compared it to the part in the movie where they picked the one girl to be in their fantasy league, but they told her um, it was only because they had to pick one girl or they had to have one girl in their league. And I mean, whether or not that was just a joke or like it was real, it's like a reflection on like how women aren't taken seriously in sport. And I never thought about it like as in fantasy. I've always just thought about it just in sports in general. But the fact that only 20% of people playing fantasy is women is a little bit of a crazy number. Um, and I'm just going to read a quote that I put in my notes from the article that I found. It says fantasy sports remain grounded, highly masculinized sports culture. While it's women who are competing in fantasy sports leagues, their success is still contingent on the performance of male athletes. I just thought that was interesting because it is true. I mean, we don't do fantasy sports for women's sports. That just isn't really a thing. I mean, it might be, but it's not popular. So I just thought that that part of the documentary was a good reflection on like the issues that we still have today and like women just not being taken seriously in sport.
I did an article. It's called "Who Invented Fantasy Baseball." It's on imaginesports.com. I realized that that's basically exactly what the video was, but it was interesting because they talked about another guy who claims to have done it. Like obviously they mentioned the rotisserie league and about buying Michael Schmidt for $26 and how it started in 1980. Where does it say? It has um in the mid 20th century, Jack Kerouac, I don't know if that's how you say his name. Um, he did like his own version of Fantasy League, I guess around the same time, where he went to the library and rented out like magazines and stuff that talked about the different stats from years previous, and he did his own Fantasy League based on previous years' stats and just details from the games and stuff and the players. And I just thought it was interesting that like because the whole thing is based on imagination, there could be different people that we don't even know about that started fantasy, but the rotisserie league gets the credit, even though they don't even get as much credit as they had. But I mean, it was different though. It wasn't the same idea. So I guess that's where Mike or Jack gets his stuff from too.
Mm-hmm.
I just like that article for that reason. Then it brought out somebody else who could essentially be given credit for starting what today is.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm not gonna lie, I don't have an article.
Mm-hmm.
I was confused because I read the article and then I watched the video. I'm like, how does the article relate to the video at all. So I didn't even like know where to go as far. I was coming in here seeing what you guys were gonna start, so like to go off of that because I was a little confused. Maybe I'll be more prepared next time. I don't have an article.
Okay. Then we can move on to 4, which was like how. What was the question? Oh, how, if at all, has the combination of the screening and the article you read changed your perspective on communication within sport? I pretty much said that it kind of changed my just like my opinion and like my view on things because I never really took the time to understand fantasy sports. It's just not my thing. But after watching the documentary and reading the article, it has me a little bit more interested. Um, I mean, I watch sports, I watch football, but I don't really study like all the stats of all the players. So it's just interesting how into it people get. Um, but I think I'm a little bit more interested now after knowing what I know about how it began and all that. So, and I feel like after reading the article, my article that I found about women in sports and fantasy kind of has me a little bit motivated maybe to join a fantasy league sometime just to like fight the gender norms and like just see what happens.
Um, for me, I said about like I also didn't do a lot with fantasy. I talked to my boyfriend a little bit about it to see what he did. He said one year he won a trophy, but um, it doesn't really make me want to get into fantasy because I really don't have the time to look up the statistics of everybody, like, or decide who's going to go where and who's going to benefit me more. But it does make me think about like other aspects of where fantasy could be played. And I don't really know if this is what he wants, but like I like theater too. Like I'm a big sport and theater person, and it just makes me think like, well, how much money could I make off of Lin-Manuel Miranda if I put him in Beetlejuice? Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, obviously you guys probably aren't into theater that way either, but like just like taking the idea of fantasy and putting it somewhere else. And I know that we're talking about like how bad it is to like think about how much money you can make off of a person without actually giving that person the credit. But it just makes me think like, could you use fantasy somewhere else? And I just
I don't know.
in the way, but
I was just gonna say they do a like bachelorette like fantasy league for the show
oh yeah,
on it, but like I know they do that for the Bachelor, so that is one other thing they do it for, which is interesting.
yes. I just think it's an interesting idea. It's not something I really want to get into though, just because of like the time.
Yeah.
Like people who do this obviously have a lot of time on their hands. But as far as communication within sports, I think the internet has done a very miraculous thing for this because obviously in 1980 they didn't have that much of an internet, and what really got the world together in doing it was a book. But now that um, fantasy is all like online and you could do it through the NFL or whatever, um, to draft your teams and whatnot. I just think that the communication has really expanded with the idea, and it'll be interesting to see how far it goes as we get more technology and stuff implemented into the games.
Yeah, that's a good point because in the documentary, I mean, they started off with doing it with pen and paper. I mean, probably took twice
Right.
as long to do it back then. Now it's just you can download an app and do it all on your phone. So it definitely, I feel like social media, the internet, everything just kind of made it a lot easier.
Me personally, I'm not interested in fantasy sports. It was interesting to learn like the history and all that, where it came from, and now it's all technological. It's pretty. I've played it, but I don't have the time for it. Like I'll play and I forget. But like to these people, they're very passionate about it. It takes up a big chunk of their lives. I think it makes like the fans feel like they're more a part of the sport than they already are. Like it's so big that on Twitter, once like if a player plays bad or a player plays good, they're turning immediately because they're all watching it live and they're also playing fantasy as well.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of just reminds me of that scene in the video where they're like on the field and they all have their desks set up. Like one of the acting scenes, they have all the numbers going around and they're like the players are walking back and forth. Like that's like what's happening in the computer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like even live, like you'll be watching, like some people be watching the game. It's like, bro, like I need Devontae Adams to get a catch or a touchdown to get me a win, or I need 7 points for a win. So it's like they're like keyed in to figuring out if they're gonna win or not. And some people, like the dudes in the video, they bet money, but like even my stepdad, I helped him draft his team. He came in second place. He won like $200-300, but the dude that came in first won $700. So some people take this really seriously, especially when you put your money on the line. It gets really serious.
Yeah, that's the other thing that like kind of discourages me from wanting to like join one or just like putting like money into it and like not knowing that I'll get anything back. Like I don't know how much
Right?
in like maybe like $20, like $30, but just like knowing that there's a chance that I won't get that money back a little frustrating and like I feel like I just don't know enough to like even put my money into it. And like you said,
Yeah.
the
And it
time.
depends on the severity of the league.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're just doing it with your friends, it could probably be just like $20. But if you're doing it with like a bunch of people who have the money,
Mm-hmm.
it could be like 100 to 200.
But I think that once you add money in the mix, I think that's what makes people get serious. Because like you put your
Yeah.
hard-earned money into it. That's why, like even back in the day when they did it, it was so big of an issue because they all put money into it.
Mm-hmm.
If without the money
Right.
being put into it, I feel like nobody would take it serious.
Yeah,
Right.
and then you wouldn't have any motivation to do well.
But then like what's the point? Like you're putting money into it to bet on people you don't know doing well.
I mean, people bet all the time on boxing matches. Are big bets. They bet on boxing matches. I'm pretty sure people want to bet on the Super Bowl who wins. There's a lot of
Yep.
apps. You got FanDuel. It's just one app. It's like Monkey Fight or something. They were telling me about where like you'll bet on if a player like who's gonna get more points this game, who's gonna get more assists. They bet on stuff
Yeah.
like that. So gambling's like really big in the sports world.
Yeah, gambling's been around in the sports world for a long time, but just like thinking of it like why would I want to? Like, you know what I mean? Why would I want to put that money out there?
It's like an
I don't
obsession.
know.
I know a lot of guys, like all my guy friends do it, and like it's a slight obsession in my opinion.
Probably.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else to discuss, I guess we could be good. We hit about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just I mean, obviously he'll know that Trishawn didn't show up, but um I did email him and ask him and he said that only one person needs to submit it, so I can just submit it for the group.
Okay.
Okay, so then we don't submit anything?
I'm pretty sure
Or
I emailed him and I said for the group project recording, do we each need to submit the file or is one person able to submit for the group? He said one person can submit for the entire group.
okay, we don't have to submit like our notes or anything.
It didn't say anything about the notes. I think that us
Okay.
discussing it on here was pretty much just all he wanted.
Okay.
Okay.
So I will submit this after we hang up.
Okay.
All right. Well, it was good to meet you guys.
Good to meet
Yeah,
you
you
guys.
too.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.